show some slides, and go from there. And as Alan says, please feel free to ask questions as we go along. Okay. So I'm going to talk about masks, but focus especially on cloth masks and look at the evidence that's there out there. And Alan shared some news. I saw this as well, that 20 people were, hauled up for not wearing masks at R&R. And I talked to some people, and some of the media people said it's not gazetted yet, so perhaps they can't take legal action against us. But obviously, it's serious for all of us right now. Okay. What am I going to cover? I'm going to cover these areas. I'm going to quickly go through COVID transmission, current understanding of it. Then I'm going to talk about the N95 and 3-ply surgical masks. Then answer this question: do cloth masks work? Do they protect others? Do they protect us? And how many layers do we need? What type of cloth do we need? Then talk about where and when we should wear masks and who should not wear them. Talk a little bit about face shields, because I think it's part of the whole equation. And then describe some masks of the future. In between, I might diverge to one or two small areas like environmental issues regarding masks. So first, some definitions. There are a lot of different definitions out there, and sometimes they're confusing. But basically, I'm going to use this word medical or surgical mask. When I use medical mask, it's going to mean an N95 mask or 3-ply surgical mask. And that's A in the diagram for the surgical mask, and C and D for the N95. There are lots of different kinds of N95. Some of them are called respirators, some come with valves. But generally, I'm going to call both of these medical masks. And then there's cloth masks, like B in the example there. And this is called by WHO as a non-medical mask. And I think that's the way we should call it. Then there's a third thing that many people are using, which is face covering. Some people lump all of these things as face covering. Some talk about cloth masks and other sort of face coverings together, but I like to separate them. When we talk about cloth masks, we're talking about B, which is a formal cloth mask. But when we talk about face coverings, what we're talking about is somebody holding a handkerchief to their face or using a scarf over their mouth and nose. It's not custom made, it's just a cloth being used. There's also this word respirator, which is sometimes used for the N95 mask. But to me, a respirator is something like E there, which has got a proper valve and a filter, and is a larger device. Europe has got its own words, and they use FFP, which is filtering face piece, which is an FFP2 is quite similar to N95, but I'm not going to use that term much. But it comes out in the data and literature when you're reading it. So as an intro, we know that face mask is part of the prevention measures, but it's not there alone. You've got to do all the others, which is your hand hygiene, your physical distancing, wide-scale testing, and of course, a change in behavior for all of us to become responsible. As I said, I've summarized data, and what I've done is I looked at a lot of studies, but a lot of systematic reviews and meta-analysis. These are, for the lay people in the audiences, are people who've taken all the studies together and condensed them into one summary kind of idea. I try to avoid opinions and try and go as much for evidence. But I'd like to say, first of all, there are a lot of false messages that are being circulated, a lot of diagrams have been circulated. And here's some examples. We've all seen this graph on the left, which is that COVID mass transmission has been out for a long time. Even somebody from MOH asked me, Amar, is there any evidence for this? And I went and looked around, and people have done fact-checking, and this is not true. It's only very partly true, but that numbers are not correct. Then recently, we've seen this one of the trousers and I pee on you, and you don't get so wet. It's common sense, but it's not any evidence-based. Then lastly, the one on the right, which circulated sometime in the past, and I suspect there's a financial motive to say that cloth masks don't work at all in that diagram. So that diagram is not evidence-based. So none of these are evidence-based. I think one of the things we should do is try not to circulate or forward information that's not evidence-based. Having said that, people are using all kinds of masks, and sometimes it's bizarre, underwear being used, sanitary napkins. Of course, this guy in the bottom right has custom made a bottle into a shield, which may be the most protective of all the ones shown here. I'm going to use about 26 references, but I'm going to focus on these 6, of which 3 I've made available to you. This is the best, the first one, the Royal Society and British Academy, which just came out just a week or 2 ago, and they have summarized all the data and focused on face masks and face coverings for the general public. It's inside the link that I've given here on the screen, this bit.ly link. You can snapshot that now, or you can go to the Facebook and get it. Then there's the World Health Organization revised document in June on the use of masks and what kind of fabric and composition. Good document to have. And finally, this lovely study by Konda and others. There are many, but I chose this particular one because it's a recent study and they look at all the filtration efficacy of a lot of the fabrics. And some people have been asking me which fabric to use. Okay, these others are good as well. These are the 6 most useful of the lot. And as I said, I've got one document inside there which has got all the rough references and all the presentation for tonight. So I'd like to start with this very important point from the Royal Society and British Academy. They say that there's some criticism for cloth masks and for masks in general because there are not enough randomized control trials. For those who are lay people, these randomized control trials are the sort of the most rigorous of the studies that we can do. And so they say that it's hard to interpret, but randomized control trials are difficult to do in a public setting and difficult to do for masks, especially now in the COVID environment. It may be unethical to do so. But the Royal Society points out a very important point, that there are no randomized control trials for physical distancing and quarantine, and yet these are being used and considered effective. So if you want to dismiss masks, as some people have done, then I think they should also dismiss quarantine and dismiss physical distancing. But we know those things are very valuable. So recognize that the evidence is evolving even for quarantine and physical distancing. So I'm going to talk about COVID transmission now. And we know that, as Ellen talked about, the body of evidence has been growing. Initially, we thought it's by contaminated objects, indirect, and then, of course, direct, somebody very close to you, and their droplets, their bigger droplets spreading onto you. And WHO recently finally agreed that aerosol transmission cannot be ruled out. Okay? But this very strong letter from more than 200 scientists and engineers in the Lancet, which is a very prestigious journal, challenged WHO to change their stance and said that there is micro droplets. There's a lot of confusion of the terminology of aerosol, but they use this word micro droplets, small droplets that can stay in the air for quite some time, even 20 to 40 minutes, and can travel beyond the 1 to 2 meters that is being proposed by most people. And in an indoor area, these droplets can travel tens of meters, greater than the scale of a typical room. So basically, all the scientists looking at all the work that they have done and others have done suggest that airborne transmission is a very important mechanism for infection. And looking at a lot of the close infections, like on board the cruise ships or in call centers, they think that is the primary mechanism. Recently, just this 2 weeks ago, this study has come out and they sampled air in the location where they quarantined individuals, and they found the virus in a lot of locations. People have done that before, but this time they cultured the virus. So that virus particles that have spread in the air and are still in the air actually can be grown, so they are infective. So I think this has been one of the strongest evidence recently for airborne transmission. The Japanese have a lot of work on this whole micro droplet spread, and unfortunately, you can't read much of it, but they can watch their videos. And here's a Japanese simulation of micro droplet movement in a room, in an enclosed room, with an air condition. And 20 minutes later, the bottom picture looks like. And so someone's just talking. They're not singing. They're not giving a public talk, but they're talking to each other, and the micro droplets are spread in the room. This Japanese simulation also said it takes 45 minutes for this room, if emptied of everyone, to clear all its micro droplets. So that suggests to us that these airborne droplets are important. Another Royal Society document, which looked at the evidence, also talked about asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic spread, and they summarized all the evidence from all the available studies. And they said that the virus load from all the studies is highest a few days before your symptoms and a few days after. And they said that all the current evidence from modeling studies, from epidemiological studies, support that asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic transmission is important in transmission of COVID-19. The majority of people also remain asymptomatic. That number has been varied. In their summary evidence, their review, they said 90%, but I've seen data as low as 30%, as high as 90%. In the local data, it's past 70%. So they feel that we should consider asymptomatic transmission as a substantive driver for COVID transmission through aerosol spray. So the summary for this first point is that we have airborne transmission. It's going to be important indoors and enclosed environments, and especially when you're using air conditioning. And it's asymptomatic transmission that's going to be an important driver, because most people who are ill today, we hope, will take some precaution. I want to say a particular point besides the air conditioning, which recirculates air and create drafts. There's also directional fans or stand fans, which are also risky because they push the air in one direction. The only place to use them, the directional fans, is when you enter a room. From the Japanese work, again, if you put this at the window and suck air out, it clears a room much faster, but not within the room. So we've seen data like this in a Chinese restaurant, showing that the person A1 is infected, but people even in front can get infected back. The aircon is here, should be blowing this way towards the table B, but some air recirculates back and comes and infects other individuals. And all of this is from aerosol droplets, and they're not small droplets, not big droplets, they're small droplets. Okay. I'm going to move on to N95 and 3-ply surgical masks. Okay. And I want to say that most of the studies for these masks have been done in healthcare settings, and they've largely been looking at protecting the person who's wearing it. That means the healthcare professional. They've rarely been looking at protecting others. So this is one of the caveats of looking at this data. The biggest piece of work is done by Chu and his colleagues, which is an urgent systemic review recently. And they look at 39 good studies on this. And they found that both N95 and surgical masks, and they also included cloth masks in their study, could be associated with a large reduction of infection. Actually, it's a very large reduction, but they're very conservative in their judgment. They say might, because they feel the studies, not all the studies may be as rigorous as they like them to be. So they say N95 is the best, followed by surgical mask, and then the cloth cotton mask. But all kind of masks work, but N95 and surgical masks the best. Okay. There's another systematic review at the same time, but this one only looked at randomized control trials and only 4 studies. And in this one, they said that the medical mask, N95 mask in the randomized control trials offered similar protection. But these studies only look at non-aerosol generating care. And for the healthcare professionals, we understand what that means. You're not doing something risky like intubating a patient, or, in the ICU setting where there's more aerosol spread. So this RCT showed these 2 masks were fairly equivalent. Of course, again, when they're worn correctly. So the summary point here for N95 and 3-ply masks is that the current evidence suggests that medical masks can result in a large reduction in virus. N95 are the better of the masks, but all types of masks work to a different degree. I'm moving on to the heart of what we're going to do this evening, which is looking at cloth masks and their protectivity towards others and their types. Okay, and there are a decent number of studies appearing, some in the past, and recently more people are fortunately doing studies for us. I must say that many of the studies are done in the laboratory setting, must bear that in mind, and there the fit is much tighter than we would have in the community. And a couple of reviews done by this individual and his colleagues showed that the filtration effective of cloth masks is generally lower than medical masks. And when they say respirators, they mean N95 there. And it varies quite extensively from all the studies. It varies according to the kind of cloth you use, the number of layers you use, how tight the weave of the cloth is, the fabric nature, and of course, whether it's water resistance in front. But, all homemade masks, when they tested homemade masks that people have made from household materials, they all show some ability to block bacteria and viral aerosols. So they all work, of course, of different degree. Okay, right. I think the best work is by Konda, and that's why I've given you his paper. But these other papers are worth looking at as well. And I think from Konda's work, where he looked at different size of particles, he says if you use a single layer, then the efficacy of the cloth mask is very variable. But once you use multiple layers and you use different fabrics in combination, then the efficacy was very, very high, even for small particles. And this improved if you make the mask tighter in its weave density. Okay, this is the data, but I like the Royal Society's summary of represent data like this. And I want you to look at the highlighted box. Here's a single layer mask at the very bottom. And then here we come to the hybrid mask. Hybrid mask meaning cotton and chiffon, or cotton quilled, cotton and fennel, all with no gaps. And you can see that the filtration for a low, small particle is very high, touching 90%. Notice that the surgical mask and N95 mask that they evaluated in their study is lower than a well-made cloth mask. So I think Konda has shown quite clearly from experimental laboratory studies that a well-made cloth mask is equivalent to a surgical N95 mask, if not better at times. Okay. Now, the best community study we've had for cloth masks has been this particular one from the US, where two hairstylists who were both COVID-19 positive and symptomatic continued working. At the time that they weren't tested yet, but they have symptoms. They wore masks, and all their clients wore masks, and not a single person who came for hairstyling got infected of those who were tested. So that's very, very powerful. As opposed to this study from Korea, which shows that a huge number of people in a call center got infected. At that time, they did not wear masks routinely indoors in Korea. And so I think these two studies are real-world studies to show the risk of having and not having a mask. So the Royal Society has summarized the effect size of masks from older studies. These are from looking at SARS and H1N1, and they suggest that the effect size of a cloth mask is at least 50%. What does this mean? If every one of us wear a mask, if you wear a mask and I wear a mask, we can cut the COVID epidemic in the world by 50%. That's quite powerful. Although Chu's work and the other work by Konda shows much higher rates, but this is a conservative estimate. Okay. So besides the type of material and the weave and all that, the fit is very important. And Konda and Chung Tai and the others have shown that if you don't fit the mask well, you can get a 60% decrease in filtration, and that defeats the purpose of wearing the mask. And that's one of the problems we see with masks, people wearing them very poorly or leaving their nose exposed or leaving gaps. Wet masks are also drop the efficiency. So if your mask gets damp, I think it's time to change it. That's one problem. I don't see people doing that. In some hospitals, I know they wear the same N95 mask for the whole day, and I'm not sure the efficacy of that mask after a couple of hours even, let alone a cloth mask that's damp. Recently, a number of people, Viola, Verma, Bala, and Dubuka, have been doing visualization studies like the Japanese to show us the effect of jets, the cloth mask jets. Okay? And they've shown that they can reduce the forward jet 90%. That means you don't expel 90% of your droplets to someone else. It also curtails the speed and the range of the jet. So here's a study from Viola. The first one is looking at N95 masks, and you can see there's some leak. There's always leak with masks, okay? Perhaps only the high-end respirator with valves is the one that may not leak. But there's some leak, but there's not much forward jet. Same with the handmade mask, and again, quiet breathing with surgical masks. So they all have a similar kind of leak, but no forward jet. I think the better study shown by Verma, here's a forward jet of someone who had a cough, and the jet can travel 12 feet. CDC in the US recommends 2 meters. This is double that distance, and that can happen in 50 seconds. And here's the second group of pictures shows a homemade mask, and you can see that the whole jet is muted. There's some leak, and the same, a cough again. And finally, this is an off-the-shelf cone-style mask. It's not an N95 mask. It's just a mask which is a cone, and again offers the same kind of efficacy as a cloth mask. So I think one of the very powerful things about the cloth mask is that it doesn't allow the jet to go and hit somebody else. So you definitely protect other individuals, and you can protect yourself by the filtration of the mask. So what does WHO say about all of this? Their current statement is when physical distancing is not possible, wearing a fabric mask is an important measure to protect others. But they say, and I've left that document with you, they say a combination of materials is important and a minimum of 3 layers is required. And it depends on the fabric you use. They also go on to say don't use stretchable material. And I fully agree that when you stretch material, then you stretch the pores in the material and you lose the filtration. They recommend that you have a flat fold or duckbill shape. And I think that if you can have a nose clip of some sort inbuilt, that would be excellent as well to reduce the leak from the mask. So WHO recommends an innermost layer, a middle layer, and outer layer. The outer layer, they recommend a hydrophobic layer, one that will repel waters, uh, propylene or polyester. For the middle layer, they suggest a hydrophobic layer or synthetic woven layer or a cotton layer. So it can be either hydrophobic or hydrophilic or a combination. And the innermost layer is a hydrophilic layer, cotton or cotton blends, which picks up your moisture as you breathe out. So MOH has got the same graphic. Basically, MOH is following WHO's guidelines. And let me go on to make it more realistic for us. People will ask you what kind of material. So the innermost layer, looking at Conda's work, the innermost layer, this is the best kind of combinations you can use. You can actually blend the innermost and the middle layer by using a cotton and chiffon, cotton and silk, or cotton and flannel, and you're going to get a very high combination of filtration rate. Many t-shirts are blended cotton polyester, so you can use them for a middle layer if you just have a cotton layer inside, but perhaps cotton and flannel is the best. Okay. What about the outer layer? Outer layer, they suggested I can't pronounce this, polypropylene. And polypropylene is that kind of bags that we carry nowadays, the kind of, semi-plastic kind of bags. And using this for the material for the outer mask is very good. And what is polyester? Polyester is anything that weatherproof, like your raincoat, your winter coat, your hiking pants, and some of these jogging pants that people use, which are sort of a synthetic material. And the best one to use is the non-woven, although some people use blended ones, but the non-woven ones are the better ones to use. So I think these are the three layers that WHO is talking, and they can be found in the house, but they can also be made by others. So what is the summary points for cloth mask? I think summary points for cloth mask, or what we should call non-medical mask, is have multiple layers, 2 or 3, Conda would say, but WHO says 3, MOH also says 3. Have hybrid constructions, combine them, and they will protect you both in transmission and protection. Not 100%, no mask does that at the present. The outermost layer should be a hydrophilic layer, and don't forget that it's got to be a proper fit. And if we do this, we might have an effect size of 50% in the population, which would be great. Okay. I do believe this time has come. I think the world has come to a place where we need to provide some very clear guidelines and maybe some standards for commercial cloth masks. There are a lot of commercial cloth masks being produced, some as a cottage industry, some sold in supermarkets and so on. I think they must reach some standard. The French have got a set of standards, which I put at the bottom of the screen there. And I like best what the Singapore government has done. They have mandated the production of these masks, and they have actually rolled them out to the entire public. And at the present moment, every single individual in Singapore has received 6 of these masks that the Singapore government has made. And that way you control the quality of masks. Of course, we could do the same thing if you provide clear guidelines and everybody makes their masks according to these guidelines. Now, moving on about where and when we should wear cloth masks, and who should not wear them. I'd like to talk about this based on WHO recommendations because they're good recommendations, and these are people who should not use cloth masks but should use a 3-ply surgical mask. That means they should use medical masks, and of course healthcare professionals should use medical masks. And if they're doing aerosol generating procedures, they should use something higher like an N95, but for everyday use they should use N95 masks. Anyone who's past 60, it's recommended that they use a 3-ply surgical mask and not a cloth mask. People with underlying chronic illnesses, heart disease, diabetes, chronic lung disease, immune suppression, should use a 3-ply surgical mask. So this could be children with leukemia on treatment, could be an adult with diabetes, and so on. And finally, if anybody is ill with a cough and running nose and a fever, they should not use a cloth mask anymore. They should use a 3-ply surgical mask because they might have COVID-19. So these are people who should wear masks, but they're not cloth masks, they're surgical medical masks. Who should wear a cloth mask then? And these are WHO recommendations again. They recommend that general public encourages cloth masks when you know that COVID-19 is spreading in your community. And where they recommend? In public settings. And what do they mean by public settings? Grocery store, at your workplace, that means inside your office, closed settings, schools, they mentioned schools, churches, and mosques. I bring this up because generally Ministry of Health follows WHO guidelines very closely. They also recommend that cashiers and servers and social workers, but I would include all the people who are doing our cleaners, wear masks. Those on public transport, definitely, and people living in cramped conditions, refugee camps and slums, and 30% of KL live in very cramped conditions. KKM has got this, not as comprehensive as WHO, and at present we are not fully clear what KKM means by crowded locations. And I think this will become clear over the next few days, but I suspect that the guidelines to follow are WHO guidelines, because KKM will follow them as well. And I think schools is the place that we are currently failing. This was sent out as a Twitter on KKM Putrajaya's Twitter feed, and they said that people who should not wear masks at all are children under 2, and I fully support that. We don't recommend for children under 2. People who are having difficulty breathing, people who are comatose, of course, we shouldn't wear masks. And finally, people with disability who need support. This would include children with autism who have difficulty or adverse to wearing a mask. My question is how to get exemption. And we need from Ministry of Health right now to come out with a very quick and effective system to give exemption to people who fall into some of these categories. I like this summary document which came from the Royal Society and British Academy. It summarized the international policies on face masks, where people should wear, and they managed to get data from 120 countries. Notice that 77% of them, 64% of them advocate wearing masks everywhere, universal or everywhere in public. That means from the time you leave your house until the time you return, you wear your mask. And I think that is probably the best advice we should give. And that's the simplest advice for everyone to remember. The only time you take it off is when you're eating and then you put it back on. I say this because we need to behave like this. We need to behave like everyone around us is COVID-19 positive, and we are an asymptomatic carrier of COVID-19 and can infect others. Why do I say this? Because from MOH data, 70% are asymptomatic. We know that temperature screening is not very effective. WHO says that as well. And we know that increasingly the unlinked cases are what are being detected. If you look at this data from Hong Kong and Tokyo, you can see the pink bars which show unlinked cases are the ones that are growing. These are cases which are unknown. We don't know which cluster they belong to. They just present with COVID-19 positive because they were tested. What's happening in Malaysia? Here's our unlinked cases for the last 1 week. You can see that we have quite a number of unlinked cases. It's possible as MOH works harder to search, we might link some of them up, but the majority are people who have actually about to leave a prison, about to enter a prison, coming for a surgical test, getting admitted to a hospital for some procedure and got tested. So these are people with no contact with known cases. So we have to assume that WHO statement, which they made earlier, in the face of known or suspected COVID transmission, community transmission is something that's happening in Malaysia despite our overall small numbers. Of concern to me is the 3 unlinked cases from 3 different prisons in the country, which are very, very compact and cramped locations. I also want to point out to you that we don't do very many tests anymore these days. We use less than 10% of our available tests, and our total test number has not grown for some time. And so we may not be feeling what's happening out there in the community. I want to show this to you before I come back to more data, that from all available data right now, these are the situations which are the highest risk situations, the super spreading situations people call. Although they've talked about super spreading people, they now talk about super spreading situations, and they're aircon, crowded, or confined space. Not necessarily crowded, but confined space. Talk a lot, especially singing, for example, in a religious setting or somewhere else. Talk loudly, longer duration of contact. And 1 meter doesn't work for these areas at all. Okay, and I created a summary for myself looking at all the available data. On the lower end, in high risk, very high risk would be going to a wedding, or a church, or mosque, temple, conference, a party, a pub and a bar, of course, is very high risk. On the lower end is, cycling, jogging, tap out some food back. In between, going for grocery shopping or the corner coffee shop without aircon are low, medium risk. Swimming pools are also low risk to medium risk because of the chlorine which kills the virus. Once you come to kindies and hospitals, these are medium to high risk. I put hospitals medium to high risk because staff all wear masks there and they're protective. Okay? And some of them wear shields as well. And finally, the high risk ones are eating in an aircon restaurant, going to a gym, using a public toilet, and of course traveling in any enclosed space like an aeroplane, LRT, or aircon buses. So I think we could stratify our risk as we think about the kind of protection we want to wear as well. Now, I want to talk a bit about misuse, accessibility to masks and reuse of masks, all kinds of masks, especially three-ply surgical masks. And I like to say that there are very few studies. There's one by Toomey, which is a rapid done systematic review worth looking at. But unprotected exhaust valve, which we've seen quite a few of our leaders wear. These are masks, look quite nice, but have a valve there. They protect the person, but they don't protect the rest of us, and they should not be worn at all. They are dangerous masks to wear for the rest of us. They're also fake three-ply masks, and we need to do something, some way to get this out of our market, especially the online market. But the biggest thing that we have is the misuse of surgical masks, which is largely pulling down to the chin, as this diagram shows at the right, or hand contamination. We see very, very commonly. People touch their mask and then go and touch things else. The front end of your mask is very risky. And if you pull your chin down to your mask down the chin, your chin is also contaminated, and you pull it back up to your face, contaminating your face. So these are not good habits, but they're very prevalent in our community. Finally, the segment that is not able to afford three-ply surgical masks. We need to ensure cloth mask is the way forward. If they use surgical masks, they're going to be reusing them, and we've seen people ironing, drying them out, chemically treating them, and this is not healthy. A three-ply surgical mask must be thrown after use. I like to also mention a bit about the environmental impact, and there's a very good piece of work done by UCL Plastic Waste Innovation Hub under this gentleman in the UK, and talking about the environmental impact. And they calculated for UK the number of tons of contaminated plastic and waste that will come from single-use masks, and they estimate it'll be 10 times more climate impact than using reusable masks. So one reason for us to use cloth masks is also to save our environment. Otherwise, at the end of 2 to 3 years of this COVID outbreak, which the time is going to take us, we may actually have damaged our oceans considerably. Okay. There's also work from France by these two individuals. One who said there's probably going to be more masks than jellyfish in the Mediterranean. Another who's pointed out that many of these masks are plastics, and they're going to have a lifespan of 450 years, so we're not going to get rid of them very quickly. Another reason to dispose of them very carefully, or not to use them so widely. I'm coming back now to face shields before I discuss masks of the future. And the reason I discuss face shields because there's some individuals who are unable to wear masks, and there's some individuals who are higher risk as well. Okay, and the problem with face shields, as the diagram shows, there are many different varieties out there. There's a high-end face shield like G, but there's a low-end face shield like F there. One of the earlier reviews done was by Robert, and he showed that, use alone, they're not enough. They are valuable, but they're adjunct equipment. But there's been recent work coming out by a number of individuals, including Chu, who I mentioned earlier. And definitely they reduce inhalation exposure by 96% immediately after a cough. And more importantly for me, I think they reduce the surface contamination of your respirator considerably. That means the mask that you're wearing doesn't get contaminated as much. Okay? So they're useful adjunct, but they cannot be used alone if you're in a high-risk place. Chu, in his systematic review with his colleagues, say that they might result in a large reduction in virus studies, and this is based on 13 studies, virus infection. There's also work looking at the sort of the plume or the spread of air from shield masks, and shield masks are very good at not spreading the virus to other people, but there's a downward displacement of the emissions. So if someone is standing below you like a child, then they're going to be affected. Or you, like a doctor, you're at a bed and you're talking to a patient, then it's going to come down to the patient at the bed. And so that's where it's not good. So I think that's what people are trying to say here. But they have a place. So here are the possibilities right now. You wear a three-ply mask. You wear a cloth mask with or without an eye shield. My wife and I used to do this, but we have moved to C now. And what is C? We wear a face shield with N95. Three-ply mask. Why do I wear a three-ply mask? Because I'm past 60. While younger, I would wear a cloth mask, a good quality cloth mask. And of course, there's D. And D, I would recommend for people who can't wear a mask at all, but they want some protection. This could be for a person with disability. It could be for a person who's having breathing difficulties. the categories we talked about where masks could not be worn, and this is, I think, still a useful thing. But if you're in a high-risk location, I would say C is what you want to go. If you're going to go to a hospital, I would say wear C. Every day, I would wear a cloth mask, and if you can, a face shield. Here's me going out to buy food, tapao, and you can see I have different kinds of shield. People, of course, look at my wife and me when we're wearing this, but I'm not really bothered how people look at us, but this is an effective measure to improve your own safety plus the safety of other individuals around you. Face shields have a place for younger children as well, and Singapore has rolled out a face shield for all younger children. I think that we should consider this for younger children who are not able to wear face masks, probably those aged 3 to 5, who have difficulty wearing a face mask for long, and you can actually eat with it, and you tend to touch your face a lot less when you have a face shield on. Here's my wife and I using a face shield to cycle. We've put off cycling for a while because of the concern of meeting people who are jogging or others on the street, motorbike passing by you. I think with a face shield, feel a lot more secure that there's no direct aerosol onto us. Okay, and these are custom face shields that we just customize for our helmet. Okay. Finally, I like to cover masks of the future. And I think this is an important area. You've got to keep an eye on this. Here's a mask that has a lot of masks are being developed. Here's a mask that my wife and I have, and some of those on Dobbs Group also have, the doctors. This is a gill mask. And it's like an N95 mask, but it's reusable. It's made of silicone, and it's got this sort of a bracket there. And what do you fill the bracket with? You fill it with your typical 3-ply mask. You can cut your 3-ply mask into 6 to 8 cuts. And so you can use one 3-ply mask at least 6 times and use that as a good filter. And we use a high-end 3-ply mask. We use a 3-layered one, so it's good. This dramatically reduces wastage, but more importantly, this is a very, very good fit. The problem is that it increases your breathing difficulty a little bit, and you can't run with this. You will have to actually walk with this. So that's one of the disadvantages. But my wife would use this when she's going grocery shopping. She wouldn't wear what I was wearing. This is an older picture. She would wear a full face shield as well, which is what I would do also. Here's another mask that's just come out. It's just produced and going to be distributed in this month. I've also placed an order with my wife for this. It's called a leaf mask. It's transparent, which is why you would like it. But more importantly, it's got 2 filters. It mimics an N99-like respirator mask. It's got a filter here which air breathes in through a HEPA filter, high-end filter. And it's got 2 filters at the side where your air goes out, and that's a carbon outlet filters. They're still deciding whether those will become HEPA filters or not. Breathing is very easy. You protect yourself, you protect other people by your exhalation as well. Problem is, it requires filter change, and it's pretty expensive. When you place an order from overseas, and this being produced in the US by a startup company, you'll actually have to order the carbon filters replaceable at the same time, so it's going to cost you a little bit of money. But I like this mask. I wish we could mass produce it and make it cheap. This is the kind of mask that the public would need to consider. Having said that, this is my personal take on what the mask of the future should look like, or maybe the mask of the present. It should be a custom printed silicone full face mask. So what I would like about this one is to extend to my eyes, because there's a lot of data talking about COVID transmission through the eyes as well. And so we need a custom printed one, silicone preferably, full face, preferably functioning like an N99, N95. And what we can do is do a laser scan of your face, do a 3D printing, have a HEPA or carbon filter, have an inlet and exhaust filters. And this is, to me, is the ideal mask. The leaf mask comes close to it, except for the lack of the eye protection that I would like to see. Do you think this is far-fetched from me? No. Here, people are already starting to design it, and many of them are very kind. They make available their 3D printable designs for you, especially the WASP group. And you can see the mask designs are different. I like the first one because it's thinking of eye protection. But I like this funny one on the left bottom, which is got a respirator unit here, which filters your air going in and out. And I like that because I think that is a possible potential way to go as well. But I think they're also experimenting with a full PPE, and they will probably aim for the eyes as well. So I think keep an eye on this area. It's an area of work in the future. I like this slide very much. Someone circulated it online and said, "Dear God, could we please uninstall 2020 and reinstall it? There's a virus." Any questions? Remember, I've left you some the full notes for the talk, which is more detailed than what I've said here. And three very useful articles that I think you should consider looking at. And let's take some questions right now.